In order to understand Aristotle's view on pleasure, it is first worth considering what he saw as the purpose of human life. Aristotle famously argues against pleasure as the core value in life, and debunks it on the grounds that it's something only masses would choose. Here's a quote from the book 1 of his Nicomachean Ethics. Now, in choosing a life of fatted cattle, the many appear altogether slavish, but they attain a hearing because many people in positions of authority experience passions like those of Sardanapalus. So this is basically the very beginning of his book, and before going into a detailed analysis of what pleasure is, he makes this observation that only people without any higher aspirations would aim for pleasure. The noble people, according to Aristotle, would either aim for honor or contemplation, echoing Plato's division of the soul and the society into three parts: rational, spirited, and appetitive. However, unlike Plato, Aristotle doesn't really see pleasure as something inherently destructive. He distinguishes between different types of pleasure and grounds pleasure in the activity that it is associated with. If the pleasure that we experience comes from a noble activity, then it might actually be a sign that we're approaching the right goal, the perfection of a certain moral or intellectual virtue. To understand how he comes to this conclusion, we have to look first at his teleology and the function argument. Aristotle is famous for asserting that all things in nature serve a specific function. It might actually be quite easy to think this way if we take certain tools as an example. Think about a knife. A knife is made for us to be able to cut things. Or a clock. A clock is made for us to be able to tell time. But while observing nature, Aristotle concludes that it's not only the tools that have this specific purpose. Everything around us in nature is actually designed to strive for or fulfill a certain end. You can think of your eyes. Your eyes are made for seeing, because this is their primary function. Without your eyes, you won't be able to see, to get any visual impressions of the world. The same thing might be applied to your heart. Your heart is designed to pump blood through the veins, so it also serves a specific function. And in general, everything in the world works this way. Plants, animals, even the stars in the sky. They're all striving for something. They're all trying to actualize their purpose, trying to fulfill their goal, what they were made for. So while observing nature, Aristotle concludes that everything in nature has a goal, has a purpose. And since everything has a specific purpose, then we need to discover the purpose of a human being, or the function of a human being, what a human being is made for. This is actually a highly ambitious task, and it might sound provocative or even unlikely to be resolved, because different people might give different ideas about what the function or the purpose of a human being is. Some would say that compassion, for example, is the highest purpose of a human being. All people must experience compassion. While others would say that a human being must exercise dominion over nature or over other human beings. So how do we actually define a human being? How do we find the right definition of what a human being is and of what a human being is made for? Aristotle suggests a very interesting approach. He draws our attention to the fact that there is a certain hierarchy observable in nature. To understand this hierarchy, we need to understand his concept of differentia, which he introduces in the categories and then more properly develops in metaphysics. Differentia is basically a property or feature that helps us distinguish one species from another within the same genus. You can think of plants, for example. The way in which we distinguish plants from some higher forms of life is their nutritive differentia, according to Aristotle. Plants are capable of nutrition and growth. In his other work, De Anima, Aristotle says that each living being has a specific type of soul. In the case of plants, it will be a nutritive soul. However, in this video, we won't focus on the soul, because it would take too much time to explain what it is, and it's not really the main topic of discussion. So we would suffice ourselves with the concept of differentia to understand his natural hierarchy. So the plants belong to the genera of living things, and its differentia is nutritive. Now think about animals. Animals are also capable of nutrition, growth, and reproduction just as plants are. However, in addition to all the faculties that plants exhibit, animals are also capable of perception, and perception is basically the differentia of an animal. Now think about humans. Just as plants, humans possess nutritional faculties. And just as animals, humans are capable of perception. However, there is something that humans have that neither plants nor animals have. This is logos. This Greek term can be translated as reason or intellect or speech. It has a lot of different meanings. However, let's say that it is intelligence in the most general sense. Humans possess intelligence, which puts them at the top of the natural hierarchy of beings. A human is zoon, logon, ekon, an animal endowed with intelligence. The question, what is a human being for, thus becomes, what is intelligence for? Because intelligence is the essential trait of a human being. Intelligence, in a sense, is a human being. It makes us what we truly are. By the way, regarding the natural hierarchy, you can also think about it in terms of locomotion. Plants are almost completely immovable, whereas animals can roam freely in space. And humans are not only capable of moving freely in space, just as animals, but also can move freely within their own minds. So they have the highest degree of locomotion as well. So we now simplify the task by reducing the question of what a human being is for to the question of what the intellect is for. But it doesn't seem to make it all too simple, because we're facing the same problem again. Different people would give different ideas about what the intellect is for. Some might say that the intellect is for gaining an advantage, like Protagoras, the sophist. Others, like Nietzsche, would say that the intellect is a certain tool of will to power. Then different people would just give a lot of different ideas. Maybe someone thinks that the intellect is for providing yourself with comforts and living a comfortable life. In my opinion, all of these different definitions of what the intellect is for seem to fall into two broader categories. The first one is relativism. It basically relativizes the intellect and says that it doesn't really have this fixed function. It can be used for a big variety of things. This is supported by observation, because people actually seem to choose to use their intellect for different purposes. Some people would use their intellect to study philosophy. Others people would use their intellect to build a company or a business, whereas other people would use their intellect to remember lines from a movie or a cartoon. The problem with this view for Aristotle would be that it doesn't really correspond to the idea of a function. That is not really what the function is about, because the function is basically the best use of a certain thing, rather than any use of a given thing. There is always this best use. For example, in a case of a knife, something that we discussed earlier in this video, the best use would be to cut. This is simply what the knife is designed for. Of course, you can take a knife and start stirring your coffee in a cup. Actually, I do that sometimes when I don't have any other clean utensils. However, this is obviously not what the knife is made for. And this is basically like that with any other objects and things. There is always this best function or the ultimate function. And we can simply misuse a thing, or the thing can just be misused in certain circumstances. But it wouldn't really contradict teleology, the idea that there is a natural place for every single thing in the universe. Of course, things can be used in a wrong way. They can be thrown into wrong circumstances. However, each single thing aspires to fulfill its natural purpose. Each single thing is actually drawn into existence by this desire to fulfill its end, its natural end. So even when a knife is mistakenly used for stirring coffee, it fundamentally, essentially still is a knife, and it is meant for cutting. The second category of wrong definition would be to reduce intelligence to some other faculty. For example, we can say that there is a certain desire for comforts or luxury or money or wealth or whatever. This desire is fundamental to human beings, and intelligence is subservient to this desire. This is actually a very popular view, and it was even popular in Plato's and Aristotle's time. This view avoids the relativistic mistake because we clearly state what intelligence is for. We can say intelligence is for providing ourselves with wealth or with money or security or anything else to satisfy our more fundamental desire. We just want something, and then intelligence is used as a tool for getting whatever we want. However, this view is incorrect because it actually undermines the natural hierarchy. Remember, there was a certain differentiation between living beings. The plants are capable of growth and possess nutritional faculties. The animals, however, are capable of both growth and movement. And the humans are capable of growth, movement, and in addition to all that, they possess intelligence. By reducing intelligence to desire, we basically reduce it to the animalistic faculty. Animals also possess desire. Animals want something and then they get what they want. So this reduction undermines the role of intelligence as something superior in this natural hierarchy. It cannot be for the sake of desire, because if it was for the sake of desire, it would simply not exist. We would not have intelligence. We would not need to be differentiated by intelligence. If we are differentiated by intelligence, it means that we need it for something higher than simply desire. The intellect, therefore, is concerned with a noble purpose or a noble goal, which leads us to the investigation of the virtue or the good as explored in Plato's and Aristotle's philosophies. The good or the virtue is exactly this noble goal that the intellect aims at. It is the end of the intellect. The good or this ultimate goal is defined somewhat differently by Plato and Aristotle. However, they share this idea that the good is something the intellect aims at. Aristotle sees it in the following way. There are different sorts of virtues that our intellect can nurture within us. For example, courage or temperance or justice. And all of these separate virtues as a whole lead to the highest virtue, which is basically the aim of a human being, the aim of human's life, which he calls eudaimonia or happiness. Happiness is achieved by perfecting these specific virtues, perfecting them with use of intellect. The intellect has a single purpose, perfecting the virtues. The virtues, however, are multiple, but at the same time, together they contribute to the good, to this final state of flourishing or happiness or eudaimonia. Now we're finally getting closer to the discussion of pleasure and of what role pleasure plays in Aristotle's framework. But before we deal with pleasure, I'd like to take a closer look at virtues and specifically at how we can either progress towards the overall good and happiness, flourishing, or eudaimonia, either to digress into the state of vice and forgetfulness about intellect when dealing with each specific virtue, when encountering a situation when a certain virtue can actually be exercised. Let's take one of the virtues, for example, courage. Courage is a virtue, therefore it is a certain work of the intellect. It is nurtured by the intellect. Now try to think about how courage actually manifests in the world. In what circumstances your intellect has this opportunity to practice the virtue of courage? Well, let's imagine a warrior on a battlefield. There are a lot of different dangerous and life-threatening situations that this warrior will encounter. However, different warriors would react to the same situations in different ways, and it does not merely depend on their wittiness or cleverness, it depends on other virtues as well. Courage is definitely one of them. Now imagine the enemy suddenly approaching. One of the warriors gets frightened and starts to flee because he is a coward. Another warrior, without any further consideration, flings himself headlong into the enemy, alone against a whole army, because he is reckless. He doesn't consider the consequences. He just experiences fear, and then his reaction to fear is simply to act, notwithstanding the circumstances. And then there is the third warrior, who calmly assesses the situation, understands that he is alone in the field and there is practically no point in throwing himself against the entire army, and strategically retreats to his own army, warns his comrades about the approaching enemy, and then together they attack. This warrior would normally be considered courageous. This is the one who exhibits the virtue of courage. By the way, this is quite similar to the account that Plato gives about Socrates retreating at the Battle of Delium, contemplating enemies as well as friends. He also said that Socrates was retreating in a way in which he usually walks in Athens. These examples clearly demonstrate that virtues, even such virtues as courage, are actually the work of the intellect. And now the question arises, are some people just born with these virtues, or do we somehow acquire them over the lifetime? Aristotle says that we can actually be trained to exhibit these virtues. And this is exactly where we arrive at the discussion of pleasure and what role pleasure plays in Aristotle's philosophy. First, I'd like to briefly explain why we had to do all this groundwork before arriving at pleasure. Well, as I said in the beginning, Aristotle has this very elitist mindset, and precisely on the grounds of this inherent elitism, he is initially suspicious of pleasure. The question is then, what is fundamentally anti-elitist in pleasure? It is the fact that all people, non-dependent on whether they're vicious or virtuous, experience pleasure or take pleasure in what they are doing. And not only people, animals also take pleasure in things they are doing. So this is something that is shared not only by humans. This is actually the point that led another philosopher, Epicurus, to conclude that since pleasure is something that is so fundamental in nature, it is supposed to be at the top of the hierarchy of values. However, this does not make much sense to Aristotle because, as we have already discussed, humans are fundamentally defined by their intelligence and not by their ability to take pleasure in things, which is a rather animalistic faculty. So in Book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics, he draws attention to the fact that only masses would choose pleasure as the sole purpose in life. In Book 7, he discusses different arguments trying to figure out whether pleasure is a good of any sort, whether intrinsically good for its own sake or instrumentally good for the sake of something else. However, the most comprehensive treatment appears only in Book 10. There he integrates pleasure into this broader system that we have discussed. Going back to this idea that virtues can actually be nurtured and acquired over the lifetime, let's now discuss how exactly it works and what factors are at play. Imagine two different people. Up until a certain point, let's say before high school, they practically had similar achievements. They were both getting A's at school, always did their homework, never skipped classes, and in general did the right things that led to their improvement. However, in high school, one of them changed in character. He started drinking, smoking weed, listening to rap music, and just dreaming about getting rich without doing much, for example, by winning a lottery. The second person, on the other hand, did not only continue getting A's at school, but also enrolled in a boxing class and started winning competitions. Then once in college, he made some useful connections and founded a successful startup that eventually made him rich. And then, even after getting wealthy, he didn't simply choose to lay around and do nothing, but, let's say, established a charity that helped people who lacked certain opportunities to grow personally, just the way he did. They both experienced pleasure, they just took it from different sources. For the first person, the pleasure was in high from drugs, in gambling, promiscuity, or in momentary fantasies that would never come true. Whereas the second person took pleasure in getting stronger, learning new things, helping others. So from these examples, we can get a clear impression that one of the people is virtuous while the other one is vicious. However, it is important to keep in mind that they actually shared the same starting point. As you remember, I said that they both were getting A's up until a certain point, and only then their paths diverged. Aristotle would see it as one of the people betraying their own intelligence and choosing the path of desire rather than virtue. There might be different reasons for such behavior, and in our case, as we can see, it is not something permanent, not something that a person was born with, but rather an acquired trait. It is important to make this contrast, because if it was something permanent that a person always exhibited, then Aristotle would actually classify it as vice, whereas our case is slightly different in a sense. And this difference is important for our discussion. Now imagine that at a certain point, this person who has so far indulged in all kinds of desire realizes that he is doing something wrong with his life, and he actually wants to make a change. But then he simply can't. No matter how hard he tries, everything simply falls apart. He decides to start going to the gym in order to take care of his health. And he actually manages to push through 2 or 3 trainings, but then eventually gives in, because he doesn't get enough pleasure from it, so he doesn't have motivation to keep pushing. The same goes for him trying to learn a new language to upgrade his qualifications. At first he manages to study consistently on Mondays and Fridays, but then eventually the discipline breaks down and he simply can't find enough strength to stick to the schedule. Aristotle calls this state of mind akrasia, literally from Greek, without power. Akrasia is a state in which a person actually wants to do good and to get closer to virtue, but each time he gets an opportunity to exercise a specific virtue, he fails because of a certain internal weakness. Aristotle actually lists different things that might cause akrasia. However, in the case of our imaginary person, let's focus specifically on the lack of pleasure that the person experiences when doing a certain virtuous or noble activity, something that he is actually supposed to do in order to improve. Here is an observation that Aristotle makes in Book 10 of his Nicomachean Ethics. The pleasure proper to the activity helps increase it. Those who engage in an activity with pleasure judge each particular better and are more precise about it. For example, those who delight in practicing geometry become skilled geometers and grasp each particular better. And in the same way, lovers of music, lovers of house building, and each of the rest advance their respective work because they delight in it. The pleasures help increase the activities, and things that help increase something are proper to it. So lack of pleasure or maybe excessive pain can actually be obstacles on the way of perfecting a specific activity. You might say then, maybe he should just take it easy, not all at once. Well, in a sense, this is the right approach. However, we're in a dangerous zone here, because the person risks getting back to indulging in vicious activities. Building on the same quote, what makes this person indulge in the base activities that he's used to is obviously the fact that they're pleasurable to him. He takes delight in doing these things as much as he despises doing what is right. It follows from here that the base pleasure, or what we can call the bodily pleasure, is more appealing for this person than, let's say, the intellectual one, the pleasure of learning new words or grammar in a language, for example. And this is actually very interesting, because for Aristotle, these are in fact different types of pleasure. In the book 10 of Nicomachean Ethics, he says, "Whether then the activities belonging to a complete and blessed man are one or more than one, the pleasures that complete these activities could be said to be, in an authoritative sense, the pleasures belonging to a human being, the remaining pleasures being such only in a secondary or much lesser sense, as are also the respective activities." So he distinguishes between the types of pleasures based on the activities that correspond to these pleasures. This is why it is important to remember the position that virtuous activities occupy in Aristotle's philosophy. Virtuous activities like the exercise of courage, temperance, ambition in its proper sense, are fundamental to the analysis of pleasure, because they contain, or better to say, produce, a proper type of pleasure. Aristotle says, pleasure completes the activity, not in the manner of a characteristic that is already inherent in it, but as a certain end that supervenes on it, as, for example, the bloom of youth supervenes on those in the prime of life. In this view, pleasure is not something that we should be primarily concerned with, because it simply follows from doing the activity in the right way. It completes the activity. So what Aristotle encourages us to be concerned with is the noble activity itself. Now, going back to our analysis of an acratic person, it is clear that his inability to take pleasure in noble actions makes him more susceptible to relapsing into base activities. But what is more interesting is that it shows that he simply is not performing the noble actions in a proper way. Because if he did, he would actually get pleasure in addition to completing the noble activities. So the question is not really how does he learn to get pleasure from the activity, but rather how does he learn to do a noble activity in a proper way. And this question can be answered in a very straightforward manner, through proper habituation. Habit in Greek is haxis, a stable state of having or possessing a certain quality. To perform a noble activity properly, one must possess the corresponding virtue. You can think about it this way. A courageous person does not just act bravely once. He has a stable disposition to face fear appropriately. The same goes for a temperate person. A temperate person controls desires for pleasure, but does so naturally, not by force, and in a repeated, stable way. So until something becomes a habit or a stable disposition within one's character, it will not be pleasurable. And it is absolutely normal that we experience pain and discomfort at first. Our goal is to keep pushing our activities toward consistency up to the point where they become absolutely natural, and only then genuine pleasure accompanying the virtue will be experienced. Once the virtue is internalized, the activity is performed naturally, excellently, and pleasurably. So in the case of our imaginary person, it is of course a good idea to take it slowly, not to make the process overly painful or traumatizing. As Aristotle says in Book 2 of Nicomachean Ethics, moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and on account of the pain that we abstain from the noble ones. However, it is important to remember that whatever we do without proper habituation can't really be pleasurable in the right sense. So it's absolutely fine to feel some pain and to do the activity despite it. until we get to what he calls the middle between two extremes, the place where virtue resides. Only then our imaginary character will be able to take pleasure in noble things. I actually like how this picture reminds us that the actions themselves are the measure of success and not our subjective impressions and feelings. Once the action is perfected, the feelings will get to their right place. But until then, we must suffer, and it is actually normal to suffer for the noble goal. It is way better than to live a shallow, complacent, meaningless life, betraying our inner potential for being humans in the most genuine sense of this word, in the sense of being animals endowed with this gift of intelligence. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you enjoyed it, like it and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments whether Aristotle's account was convincing enough and what parts of this account still seem to be questionable. See you in the next discussions on philosophy.